Okay, let's get started. All right, on Laulima, in the resources, the daily work folder, the folder with today's date, let me go ahead and click on the HTML file there. Okay, so we're gonna work again on project one. Okay, we're gonna take up where we left off last time, which is with the helpers.php. We're going to write some scripts that are actually one script that's going to make use of that. If we have time, we'll also make something where we can add the users in. But I want to work on the login.php and handle login.php. Now, the second item there listed complete lab 5. Some people already have done that, or by now a handful of people have done it. A bunch of people turned it in and it wasn't quite done correctly. Some people made it so that they use the JSON.dump string to create the JSON representation, which was done correctly, but they also tried to do one with a for loop, and that was not done correctly. So the people that did that, you got comments on your what you turned in, but you don't have a score yet because you need to fix that. So I'll spend some time later talking about what went wrong with those of you that just use the for loop to do that. You can do it with a for loop, and I'll talk about how you can do it that way. But we'll get back to that in just a little bit. Okay, so let's return back to project one. Okay, let me take a step backwards. In the daily work folder, if you look at what we had last time, in addition to the HTML file that kind of outlines what we did, there's also a zip file, and then that zip file has the docs folder inside of it. Inside of docs, there's a couple of folders. One is CENT280, and inside of that, there's a project one folder that has the main PHP scripts, of which we don't really have much at this point. And then we also have inside docs a project one folder that has the helpers.php and then the init.sql and stuff. So if you were to take that and expand it, that would take you up to date from where we left off last time. Okay, now I'm going to upload a similar thing for today's daily work that will get you up to date toward to the point where we reach today. Okay, so I'm going to just put that leave that on that folder. All right, so returning back to project one. Okay, we're going to have some PHP scripts. Okay, remember that what you need to do eventually, okay, so init.sql, that one is taken care of. Helpers.php now basically has all the stuff. So if you take the zip file from last time and you look at helpers.php, that's up to date. Okay, home.php we didn't create. Login.php we did not create. Handle login.php, that's also not done. So the first three we need to work on that. We probably will only get done login.php and then hopefully handle login.php. Okay, and then remember you have to do an explanation of how the passwords were stored. So last time we talked about how we used the SHA-512 hash. And in addition to that, we salted the password before we hashed it. And the salt basically contains a hash itself that involves the current date and time concatenated with the password. Okay, so what you wind up for the encoded password, remember, is a doubly hashed, randomly salted password. Okay, and so that does a couple of things. Okay, one is that we're not storing stuff as clear text. We're storing something that looks like a hexadecimal string. But because it depends on the random salt, you also have to store the salt that was used to create the encoded password. So a large part of what we did last time, let's take a look at where we ended. Okay, so I'm going to the main Docker folder, the docs folder, and I'm going to open up project 1. Okay, and then I have a add users.php, and then we'll probably modify that after a while. But the main thing we worked on last time was the helpers.php. Okay, so let's review this a little bit, right? If you look at the PDO string when we're trying to connect, okay, the one thing that you gotta make sure you talk about in getting when you're trying to do the setup for your project is to correctly get that IP address. And the 2 previous assessments, so today's one was what, 7? So 5 and 6 actually asked one question twice, so both in 5 and 6, and that it was asking, let's go to the answers here. Okay, so we could look at either one, but I'll look at this one here. Okay, what's the command to get the IP address for the Docker PHP Apache container, which is what we need to connect to basically when we are looking from outside, so in the host, but outside the container. And it's that first command there, right? Docker machine IP for the IP address, and then you need to put the name of the Docker machine, which was my Docker. Okay, so, and that was asked twice, and the class did miserably both times. The first time, I think one person got it correct, and the second time, maybe 3 or 4 people got it correct. Okay, so that's the correct answer. Okay, make sure you review those things because they could be helpful. And in fact, that one right there is helpful for project 1 when you turn it in, because that's part of the documentation you need to put in there for setting up your project. Okay, so that's where this IP address comes from. So from the Docker machine, the IP value for my Docker, that's what it is right there. Okay, so, oh, wait, sorry, no, let me take that back. Okay, that's not true. Okay, mistake. Okay, this number here is what you get when you go Docker network inspect, and then you put, yeah, because this is the PostgreSQL stuff, so okay, I misspoke there. That other one is important, that's for when you actually connect to the web page, and we'll look at that actually today. This one here is what you get, okay, when you inspect the network. Okay, so let's go and do that because I misspoke there. So let me try to repair that error. Okay, so I'm going to start up a ConEMU terminal. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the environment variables. Okay, and I'll probably want a second shell also. So let me go ahead and open a second ConEMU terminal and again enter the environment variables. Okay, and in both of those terminals, I'm going to change to the main Docker directory. And I'm going to bring up the Docker containers. Okay, so going back to that string that we set up to connect to the PostgreSQL container. Okay, I misspoke earlier, so let's correct that right now. The way that you would obtain that, okay, so now that I got my Docker environment set up, would be to first go Docker network ls to list all the Docker networks. And of course, the one that we're looking for is this, right? That's the name of our main Docker folder, but it takes out any underscores or hyphens or things like that. And if you look at the ID for that one, it's 2A06F3. Okay, so that's 2A06F3 is probably good enough. So I'm going to go Docker network inspect, and then I'm going to put 2A06F3, and then I'm going to pipe this to group regular expression and ignore case gateway, so I don't have to worry about if it's spelled with a capital G or lowercase g. And then that's the address. Okay, so I misspoke earlier. This is the correct way to look at it. Okay, that's how you obtain the correct address for connecting to the Postgres SQL database. Okay, so okay, and what about getting to the PHP Apache? That one is actually, you can get it even from this terminal here, which is basically starting up the Docker machine. Okay, so I could say Docker machine IP my Docker, and that's the one that's going to give us the URL address, right, the IP address for when we're connecting to the PHP scripts that we're setting up for project one. Okay, so that's another important one to look at. Remember that you also have to look inside of Docker compose.yaml for the port, and the port actually is 8080, right? So let's bring that up also just so that you can see. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the main Docker folder and then open up Docker compose YAML, and then you can see on the PHP Apache container that where we need to look, okay, to get the port on the host, right, outside the container is 8080. Okay, so we're going to actually look at that in a little while because we want to work on the main PHP scripts. Okay, so we'll get started with that in just a moment. Okay, so those are things that are very important, okay, for your setup for your project. So make sure you start noting those things down because they are going to be very important in the documentation. Okay, let me remind you that the documentation, right, explanation of passwords and then the explanation of the project setup, those two things right there is worth 60 out of 100 points. So even if your project works perfectly, if your documentation is bad, you're going to get a bad score. So do not do that. Okay, make sure your documentation is good. Okay, so returning back to helpers.php, okay, that's where that number comes from. Okay, that's from looking at, by inspecting the network, the Docker network, that's how you get that number. Okay, now, here's a couple of things we looked at. The do hash, make salt, and make encoded pass, that basically we use those three functions together to come up with the encoded password, which is what we store. Okay, but because that depends upon the salt, and the salt is randomly generated because it depends upon the current date and time out to the nearest second, okay, then you have to store the salt as well, because otherwise you have no way of doing authentication, right? Checking to see if the username and password match. Okay, so what that meant was that we have to have a function that adds the user, and at the same time, sort of the other function that goes along with it is a function that I named checkID that takes into account exactly how we stored that password. Okay, so what happens is that when we store the password, we're going to store the first name, the last name, and the email address, and the email is their username, basically. Okay, And then we're going to store the salt and the encoded pass. And so we need to know how the salt is related to the encoded pass in order to do the authentication in the check ID, right? Those two functions go hand in hand. Okay, so let's look at this just a little bit. Let's remind you what happens when we create the salt. What happens is you pass the password, okay? So you got the username and the password, you pass the password, you concatenate it. Remember in PHP, the period or the dot is the concatenation symbol with the current date and time out to the nearest second. Okay, so theoretically, if you ran this very quickly, okay, in a row on the same password, then it would generate exactly the same salt if you were able to do it within that 1 second, right, in which the time doesn't change yet. Okay, but the chance of that happening is relatively small. Okay, but because it's possible, we change the make encoded pass function to act so that you actually pass it the salt. So look at what happens by the time you make the encoded password. You take the original password, which is this $text, right? You are going to have already pre-generated the salt from that password, and the way you do that is a random, right? This is the time. So you have this, and then you take the SHA-512 hash of it. So the salt is a SHA-512 hash, okay, of the password concatenated onto the end of the date time string. Okay, so then that's SHA-512 hash, and it's random because it depends upon the current time, date and time. All right, so then we pass that value and the password to the make encoded pass function, and so what it does is it takes the randomly generated salt, which is already a SHA-512 hash, concatenates that onto the end of the password, and then does another SHA-512 hash on it. Right? So that's why we say it's a doubly hashed, randomized salted password. Yeah? So it's a password with a random salt and is doubly hashed because the salt is hashed once, and then when you concatenate that onto the password, then it gets hashed again. Okay, so that makes it very difficult, okay, for programs like John the Ripper, even if it gets the make encoded password, okay, to basically go back and figure out a text that will actually work correctly. Okay, so salts make it harder for programs like John the Ripper to figure out what the password or what a suitable password would be. Okay? And if you randomize the salt, it makes it even that much harder. Also, if you use SHA-512, which is what we're using instead of, say, MD5, okay, then the number of characters that you have to deal with is much, much, much larger for SHA-512 versus MD5. MD5, I would not even recommend that at all for anything where the password needs to be protected well. Okay, but at the same time, right, this does not prevent somebody from getting into trouble if they have a really stupid password like ABC123 or something like that, because if somebody just happens to guess the correct password, then, right, defeats this whole system. It's like, you don't even care about the encoded password if you just guess the password correctly. Or if somebody has a pretty good password but they can't remember it and they write it down on a piece of paper and they stick it on their computer or something, that also defeats the purpose of this kind of thing. Okay, so we got our add user, excuse me, and we store the user's information in a way that the salt that was used to generate the encoded password is stored along with that in the record. Okay, so then, excuse me, our check ID takes that into account. Let's review basically how this works. Okay, so first we get a connection to the database, And if we can't get a connection, this function returns, so it basically stops at that point, right? Any function, when you hit a return statement, that effectively ends the function. But of course, we're only going to end it if we can't get a connection to the database. All right, then the first query that we run is just selecting all the fields from the user's table where the email matches whatever the user entered for the username. And last time I made a mistake by not putting the single quotes around this, but you have to put those single quotes because that's a string, right? So we then run the query and then we count how many records are returned. Because in the user's table, okay, we set the email field to be unique. In fact, let's take a look at that. Now let's open up init.sql, right? Because we set that to be unique, then if the user name is in the user's table, then this should be exactly 1. That's what $count should be. Okay, so if it's not exactly 1, we're going to return a -1. The -1, the only thing about that that's important is that could never be a valid ID for the user, because the user's IDs is going to start at 1. So you cannot have anything like 0 or -1. So this is returning definitely a invalid ID number, right? So that's the key thing. Negative, you can never have a valid ID number that's -1. Okay, so that's what it'll do. Checks to see if it's not 1, then something went wrong. So most likely what it is the user doesn't exist, right? The user is not stored in the user's table. But if it is equal to 1, then what we do is we start fetching the information in that record as an associative array. That's what this means, PDO, fetch associative. It returns it as an associative array, which means instead of accessing the values using an index like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever, what you need to do is pass the name of the field name in order to get the value. So we get the stored salt, okay, and of course we're not even going to do this unless we know the row count is 1. And then we get the stored encoded password. And then what we do is the following. We take the stored salt and concatenate that onto the end of the past password, the password that the user enters, and that has to match the stored encoded password. If it does, then we're going to return the user's ID. Okay, so if it was the first user, the ID is 1, it's going to return a 1 and so forth. Okay, but if that's not true, so if I take the stored salt, concatenate it to their password, it doesn't match the stored encoded password, then we return a -2 saying that the user exists in the user's table, but the password that you supplied is bad. It doesn't match. Okay, so we can tell by looking at what gets returned from the check ID function whether the person logged in correctly, in which case the ID will be greater than 0, right? Because it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 or something. Or if it's a -1, the user doesn't exist, so either you entered a bad username or that person actually isn't in the user's table yet. Or if it returns a -2, that means the username exists, but they supplied a password which is not the correct password. Okay, so that's basically what those functions do. Okay, so what we want to do today is we're going to first write in a login.php, and actually that file doesn't have any PHP commands inside of it. It's basically straight HTML markup, but it's important markup just to see so that you understand how those kind of things work. Okay, and then we're going to write a handle login.php. And then that one will have to connect to the database. That one will have to execute some PHP commands. Okay, any questions before we start working on those PHP scripts? Okay, so what I want to do then is I'm going to go to Windows Explorer, and here I'm into my project one folder which is where helpers.php is. I'm going to go up to docs and then down into CENT280 and into project one. And right now all we have in there is that test connect just to verify that we can actually reach the Postgres SQL database from the PHP Apache container, right? That basically is what that was for. Okay, so if we take a look at that, just so you can see, we require this because that has the connect function defined in it. We call that connect function, and if we don't get a connection, then we're going to say could not connect, and we end the script. If we do, okay, then what we're going to do is say connected successfully. This part right here was just a very simple test of the functions that we created in helpers.php last time. So if we were to run this, we ran it just at the command line last time, but we could actually look at the results in a web browser, and then you're going to see things get piled up all on one line because this doesn't have any break elements in it, right? The new line character only is helpful when we're running it from the command line, but it would have demonstrated that what happens if I do a SHA-512 hash on test, what happens if I run the make salt function on that same string test, and then also what happens when we run the make encoded password function on that test along with the salt. And then we added one user in, okay, and then we called check ID for that user. This would have returned a -2 because the password doesn't match. And then line 14, that would return a -1 because johndoe@gmail.com has not been added to the database at this point. Okay, so this is what we did last time. Okay, so I'm going to go into the PHP Apache container. In this terminal, and in this terminal here, I'm going to go into the Postgres SQL container. And while I'm in the Postgres SQL container, I could, in fact, what I want to do is switch into the project one folder. Okay, let me do an ls to show you this is the one that has init.sql and helpers.php and everything like that. Okay, and then I want to change to that directory because when I enter in, right, into the database, project one underscore db as Bob, and enter some pass, then I want to be able to run init.sql to clear out the database. Yeah? So here I just cleared out the database. Now if I come back to this and I change into the project one folder and I do an ls, there's that test underscore connect.php that we used last time to test out the helpers, the changes to helpers.php. So if I run that, okay, what I see is that -2 and that -1. Okay, so there's a SHA-512 hash of test. This is the salt that's generated, and then here's the encoded password. If I run this program again, so I'm just going to run it again, you would see that, of course, if I just do the SHA-512 hash of test, that's exactly the same as before. But the salt and the encoded password are different, right? Because the salt changes even with the same password, because it's a different time, right? So the time changed, so those two things change. This is still -2 and -1 because what I did was I put an incorrect password in for Jane. I'm gonna change that to the correct password, okay, and then come back here. I'm gonna run it again, and then now I get Jane Doe's ID, which is a 1. And then so let's verify that that actually is returning Jane Doe's correct ID. So here we're going to go select, and we'll just go ID, comma, first name, comma, last name from users. And then you can see Jane Doe's ID is in fact 1. Okay, so this returned the correct result. This one here returned a -1. Why is that? Because John Doe has not been added yet, right? And the other thing we talked about a little bit last time, why is it that when I call add user, and I called it several times after I already cleared the database, I called it 3 more times after that, why is there still only 1 user in the users table? That's because the email address has to be unique. Yeah? So if you try to put in janedoe@gmail.com more than once, it won't let you, right? So it prevents a user from being added more than once, okay? Which is an answer to the assessment thing that you folks took a little while ago. Okay, so any questions at this point? Now, remember, okay, the IP address 192.168.80.131, I could go to the browser, okay, and then type that in, 192.168.80.131, okay, and then put port 8080, and then I will be connected to the web root. If I type project 1, then I'm inside the project 1 folder inside the web root. Okay, so remember this number here, 192.168.80.131, right? That's what you get if you go Docker machine, IP, my Docker. Okay, so that's the one that we are going to use here. Okay, and then so if I hit an enter, I should go and I can see testconnect.php. So if I click on this, okay, to run it, okay, by the way, this is a very bad practice not to put an index.html or index.php that blocks, okay, directory browsing like this, but that's okay, we're just testing stuff out like this. So I click on this, and you can see, right, everything just piles up all on one line, except it can't fit all on one line, so it wraps around. So that's the beginning of the SHA-512 hash of the string test, T-E-S-T, all lowercase. Then somewhere in there, there's a salt, and somewhere in there, there's a make encoded password at the end of it. Then there's a 1, because Jane Doe was validated, and a -1, because John Doe does not exist in the database. If I hit a reload, then what would happen is that the SHA-512 hash of test is still the same, but the salt and the encoded password is different if you take a look at it like this. Okay, so if this were a real web application, testconnect.php, we would just wipe it out from that directory, right? We wouldn't want people to be running that, okay? And because we wouldn't want them to be able to get to see what's here. Now, you might think, and I've seen this on a number of websites talking about doing web security, they say it's okay to put stuff like this. This is bad, right? It shows Jane Doe's username and password. That's bad. They say it's okay to do that because it's a PHP script, and PHP will never show the contents of stuff here. It just shows the results of echo or var dump. We used var dump last time. Okay, but while that's true, as long as the PHP interpreter is running, if for some reason, right, when you load the Apache modules and the PHP module doesn't load, what's going to happen is the interpreter is not going to work. If I try to go to this page, instead of showing this, it's going to say it doesn't know what to do with this PHP file. Would you like to save it? Okay, and of course, then if somebody's trying to break into the system, they say, oh, I'm going to save it. And then they can take a look and they can see exactly these contents, right? So this should not be in there. We only put it in there to verify that we could connect to the helpers.php, and we use that to test out, okay, our helpers.php, the functions that we put inside of there. All right, so what do we want to do? Okay, so I'm going to come here. Oh, actually, I was in the right place. Testconnect.php. I'm going to go new, and I'm going to create a new file. Called login.php. So when I save this, right, I remember I'm editing it in the host, not inside the container. Okay. When I save this, I want to put it inside the project 1 folder that's inside CENT280. This has to be inside the web document root because we're going to visit this page in the web browser. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Start off like this. So I'm going to go save, and I've got 2 project 1 folders here that are recent. Okay, so if I click on this one, that's the right one because that's inside of CENT280. Okay, so that's okay. And then, okay, then I'm going to change the name to login.php. Okay, so if you look at the path to there, right, it's inside of project 1, which is inside of CENT280. That's the correct one. That's inside the web document root. Okay, so let's put in something that's going to be a very simple test, and we'll get rid of this once it already works. Okay, so I'll put echo, this is a test. And I'm going to go back to the browser, okay, and then I'm going to open login.php. And so what I expect to see is that it's going to say this is a test. And it does. Okay, so I'm connecting properly from the web browser to that page. Now what we're going to do is add the HTML markup so this can be used for an actual login page. Okay, so let's do that. All right, so this, I'm going to get rid of that because I don't want that. Now, when you are doing a PHP script and you have parts of the script that are just pure HTML markup, okay, then what I recommend doing, and which is what I'm doing right here, is to put that markup down below wherever the PHP scripts are. So this is outside of the PHP script. The reason why is because then you can just enter it straight as regular HTML markup like this. Okay, so here, let's do it real simply. I'll put HTML, okay, and then when I hit and enter, it gives me the end tag. So there's my end tag. I want to check something here. Indent width, I want to set that to 3. Okay, and then, so I hit and enter, then I'm going to need a body element. Okay, so I got my body element in there, and then I'm going to start putting in things that go into what we call an HTML form element. Okay, so we need to put in a form element. Here's how it starts. But instead of just putting the end of the start tag, I need to put in 2 very important attributes. Okay, so the first attribute that we usually set is a method. And the way that you generally want to pass things from one web page to another web page when you have a form is the post method. The other option is get. Get basically puts the variables, the get variables and their values as part of the address, the web address. So very insecure because you can see the name of the variables and the values of them. So we always use post. Plus post can handle more variables. Okay, so it's the way we would always do it. So if you take CENT285, that's the way you would set it up. Okay, then the second attribute we have to set is the action. And this is where you put the name of the processing script for the form. Okay, so what is a form? Form is used to gather input. Part of the form should have a submit button, so when you click on submit, then the contents of whatever they put, whatever the user inputted, is going to get sent to a processing script. The way you specify the processing script is in the action attribute. Okay, so I'm going to put handle login.php because that's the name that I want to use for my processing script. Now that processing script doesn't exist yet, okay, but that's okay. I want to leave it like that. Okay, so that's how we start off our form. If you viewed the page right now, which we can look at it in the browser, you're not going to see anything. If you type Control U, though, you can see that the form is in there. You see how it shows handle login.php? If I were to click on that, I would see an error because that file doesn't exist yet. So you get a file not found error. Okay, but don't see anything here, but by typing Control U, you can see what's coming out. If you're looking at HTML markup, although it'll start off with this thing in red, if anything else is in some kind of funny color, you probably have something wrong with your HTML markup. Okay, so it's not a bad idea to look at this. Let me blow it up in size a little bit easier to see. So this is in red, that's normal. The rest of the stuff shouldn't have any red or funny colors other than what you see here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is start putting things into the form. So I'm going to put a very simple prompt, and this prompt is just going to be text, username with a colon, like this. And so if I save that, and I go back to this, and I hit Control R for refresh, then you can see my prompt shows up there. If I look at the page and I hit reload, now we see something on the page, right? Although this actually is more useful information while we're building it up. So that's usually how we do it. Okay, so we got username, then I'm going to put in an input element. Okay, so many times when you're building up a form, then the type of HTML element that you put in is an input element, like this. So input, and we're going to use a text box. So we say type equals text. That means it's going to be a text box. And then we want to put in another attribute, and that's the name for this input field. Okay, so I'm put name equals, I'm going to put user. All right. So input is one of those HTML elements that doesn't have an end tag. So you can put a slash and then the greater than symbol, and that basically is telling the web browser that that's the end of this. There's no start tag and end tag. There's only a start tag, right? Input just has a start tag like this. So if I go back to the browser and I type Control R for refresh, I can see that that's put in. I go back here and type Control R, and then you can see there's a text box here, all right? So it still doesn't do anything, but now I have my username and I got a text box to enter it. So janedoe@gmail.com, for example. Okay, that's what we're going to want to enter into that eventually. All right. So we have that, and what we want to have happen is if I put in password as the next prompt, like this, and I take a look at it here, and I go Control R, what am I saying? Okay, then it looks like this, but if I reload the page here or hit Control R, it puts password on the same line, which I don't like. I want to put password on the next line. So what that means is that at the end of this previous line, I'm going to put a break element so that it goes to the next line. Notice I'm going back and forth here. This one, if I type Control R, nothing happens except it puts that in. But I put Control R here, and now the prompt is on the next line. That's what I wanted to do. Okay, so I'm going to put in a second input element. and type equals, okay, let's say we put in a text box. And I'm going to put the name of this variable as PASS for password. And I did something like this. Okay, actually that's not correct, so I'm going to change that. But let me show you why that's not correct. Okay, so if I come here and I go Control R, reloads it, okay, Control R here, looks like this. Okay, so let's say this were, I was setting this up, and Jane Doe's password is Janie. This is no good, right? Because somebody looking over or from the side can see the password. So when you're trying to generate an input form for the password, you don't want to use text, right? So this is not correct. But what is the correct name for this text box? You want to use a password box. So you just put in password like this. Okay, so I save that, come back to here, I go Control R. Yeah, I'm looking at there because I don't want to see red except here, right? So this looks okay. Then I come here and I hit a reload. And then so if I enter Janie, then that's okay, right? It doesn't show the actual text being typed onto the screen. All right, so this is both good and bad, this style, right? One is it doesn't show, right, what the password is. The bad part is it shows how long the password is, okay, which maybe is not information you want somebody else to have. Okay. So, when you're doing stuff at the command line, a lot of times they make it so when you're entering in a password, then it doesn't echo anything to the screen. That's good because they don't know how many characters it is. They could kind of guess if they watch how many times you hit the keyboard, but they don't know exactly how many there are. Also, if you have a long password, you know, then people get intimidated, so they wouldn't even try to guess it after that. Okay, but the thing is, if you're entering it doesn't echo anything back, and you think you made a mistake, then there's no point in hitting backspace because that just puts more characters in the buffer. So what you have to do is type Control U and then start all over again, and then that clears the buffer, right? Control U. Okay, but not on this kind of screen. All right, so we're getting a little bit closer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put an extra break character, and then I'm going to put in my submit button. Now the submit button, the standard way of putting it in is it's another type of input. Okay, so it's still an input element, but when you put the type, you say the type is submit. Okay, and then I'm going to specify the value, and the value is just the text that shows up on the button. So if I put OK here, okay, then just checking to see if that looks okay. I'm going to hit a Control R here to reload. It puts an OK button like this, right? So if I put the words submit here, then that's what would have shown up on the button, right? So the value just specifies the letters that show up on the button. Okay. All right. So you try to put something that, you know, it says submit or enter or OK or something. So let's change it to enter so you can see how that affects things. Okay, so I put enter, I reload this, then it just changes this to enter, right? That's all that value does in this case. Okay, so if I did this, and then I put in a password, and I hit enter, then it actually tries to go to handle login.php. Okay? And you get this error message, and the error message says that that script doesn't exist. That PHP file doesn't exist, which is correct. We don't have it yet, okay? But that's all right. We have this like this. Okay, so we have our login.php, and actually that's all it's going to consist of, just something like this. So two things which are very important about this that you're not going to see just yet are the names that we put for our two input elements that handle the username and password. these values are very important because when we pass things via post, when we look inside the global, super global post array, which is where the post values will be stored, it's an associative array and the values are stored and these are going to be the keys in this, okay? So I specifically chose names that are not the same names as the database field names or anything like this. I could choose anything here, but you try to choose something that makes sense, okay, so that when you're writing the handle login.php, that you're going to make use of these variables, basically, okay, so user and pass. I could have put username and password, okay. I could have put Ernie and Bert too, but that doesn't make any sense, so I'm not going to do that, right? I try to choose something that actually tells you what that piece of data is supposed to be. Okay, so I will upload this in a little while, okay, but let's actually look at handle login.php first. Okay, so in fact, no, let me stop right there. I'm going to take a break for a few minutes, so if you just have a few things wrong with this and you just want to fix yours, you can go ahead and fix it. Then we're going to come back in a few minutes and work on handle login.php. Okay, so let's start working on this handle login.php. That's the one that, because it's not there yet, we got an error when we clicked on that submit button. So let's go ahead and take a look at that one. All right, so I'm going to go new here. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. And this needs to be saved in one of these project one folders. So I'm going to try this one. Yeah, that's the correct one because it's inside of CENT280. And I'm going to go handle login.php. Okay, and if you didn't want to do that, you could, of course, start at the top and then work your way down to it. Now, what this is going to need to have is a connection. Let me set my indent width to this. It's going to need a way to connect to the database. So this statement right here, which we verified that already can connect to the database, I'm going to just copy and paste that into this. Okay, so that's an advantage of having created tests_connect.php because by using that, we know we can connect to the database, the backend database. And so when I write this script, I could just copy and paste that part of the code. The path to that helpers.php we know works correctly. So this is set up so that should work. And so let's do the basic thing that we will always do when we need to connect to a database. We call a connect function. Okay? The way that the connect function is defined, you don't need to pass anything to it because the information about username and password and the database name is all stored inside of this file, which is located outside of the document root. Okay, can't get there. Okay, the web document root. And then what we always do is we check if $PDO is not created, then we call the die function and we say could not connect. Okay, so what we want to do to make this thing work initially is something real simple. We're just going to go echo connected. Okay, so how do we test this? We could test it directly in the browser, but let's test it on the command line first. Okay, so I'm going to come back here to this shell. Okay. You can see, right, handle login.php is in that directory. I'm in the PHP container, PHP Apache container. So I'm going to check for syntax errors. Okay. And I got one, so I got to go and fix that. remember, I didn't do that for login.php. Why? Because login.php just had HTML markup in it, right? It looks like this. Doesn't have any real PHP commands. So even if I do PHP-L on this one, doesn't matter because there's really no PHP in it. But this one has some, and in fact, what we see is that on line 7, I'm missing a semicolon, it looks like. And, oh, actually what I did is I put this parentheses, ending parentheses there, and that shouldn't be there. Okay, but I go back and check this. Okay, no syntax errors. If I go php-f and I run handle login.php, I see the word connected here. So not only no syntax errors, but now I verified I connected to the database. I can connect to the database. That's very, very important. Okay. So now that I verified that we're connected, I'm going to comment this out because I don't need to see that at this point. What I would like to see is what is getting passed in what we call the post super global array. Okay? And that has a name $_capital POST. Now, what if I just did this? I go echo $_POST like this. Okay. Let's check for syntax errors, right? We're doing PHP programming, so let's check for syntax errors. No syntax errors. I'm going to run it. And what you see right here is just the word array. Okay. So because $_post is an array, that's not the appropriate way to display the contents of it. It just verifies that it's an array. So what you have to do is use the var dump command. Okay, so if you take CENT285 at some point, okay, remember that in PHP, if you want to display the contents of an array instead of a single valued variable, then use var dump. Okay, that's variable dump, that's what it stands for. That allows you to display the contents of an array. Okay, so I come back here and I check to make sure I don't have any syntax errors, and then I run it, and then, oh, it displays this stuff. Okay, so that's not telling me a whole lot, but except that actually that it's empty. Oh, how come it's empty? Because I'm running this from the command line, okay, there's nothing passed via post. Because on the command line, there's no such thing as post. Post is a mechanism that's basically in the browser, right? So the browser, when it sends a request, it can send either a GET request or a POST request. A POST request is one where it sends data along with the request itself. So this actually shows this right here, but it doesn't tell us anything about what was passed because nothing was passed. This was all run at the command line. So I have to, at this point, go to the browser, but at least I know there's not any syntax errors, right? And so I can go ahead and enter a password in like this and hit enter. And instead of getting an error message, because handle login.php did not exist before, now it exists. And what you can see with var dump, okay, that what it does is it tells you that it's an array that has 2 elements. And each of those elements are, okay, key value pairs. So here's the key called user. The value of it is a string that has 17 characters. Okay, and then the actual value is janedoe@gmail.com. The second key, pass, and I say second, that's not the order, that's just another key. But the other key, pass, is a string with 5 characters, and then I had my caps lock on, I guess, when I typed it. the value of it is Janie. So if we were trying to check to see if that actually authenticates, we should have got that it did not authenticate, right? Because I entered the wrong password in this case. Okay, but user and pass, where are those coming from? Those are coming from, okay, I still have this up, the names that we assign to those input fields. So if I change these to different names and then I try to run it again, then you're going to see that the value of those things change. Okay, so let's do that. We will change it back eventually. But if I had done this, okay, so instead of the name is U for user and P for pass, I'm going to just use U and P, come back to this page. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this page. I'm going to hit a Control F5 to force a reload. Okay, so that clears everything out like this. And then if I put janedoe@gmail.com and I put in Janie here and hit enter, then notice that the name of the post variable, we call these things post variables, is now U and P, because that's what it was set as inside of this, right? So let me hit Control R. Yeah? So U and P. So that's why this comes out U and P. So the point is that whatever you choose as your names for your input fields, that's very important, because when PHP passes the stuff via post, it uses those as the names that gets passed along, right? So U and P, not database field names, that's just simply the names you put in the HTML markup. Okay? So we need to fix that. Let's switch it back to user and pass. Okay, so I save this, come back here. If I reload this, it's user and pass. Come back to this, I force a reload, Control F5, right? Make sure nothing is cached. And so if I put in janedoe@gmail.com and Janie, and I hit enter, then this is back to user and pass. Okay, so what I'm going to do, let me move this a little bit. And I'm looking at handle login.php. I can still see what I have up here, and I can see the correct names for stuff is user and pass. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take away this statement. I'm going to say $username is equal to $_post and so this name here, user, right, that has to match this. So if I want to get password and store that, okay, I can do it that way. Okay, so this PHP variable $username, we're storing the value that's passed via post that has a name of user, and this PHP variable $password is storing the value from, again, the post super global array, which has a name of pass, P-A-S-S. Okay, so I got those two things, and what I'm going to do is just echo them to the screen. So echo, I'll say username, $username, and I'm going to put a break element in there, and I'm going to do the same thing for password. Okay, so I go back to the command prompt and I check for syntax errors. No syntax errors, but there's no real point in running it from the command line because the variables are not passed via post on the command line. It's only inside of the browser. So I'm just checking for syntax errors here. Then I'm going to go back to the browser. Okay. force a reload, Control F5, and I'm going to put in something. So here, janedoe@gmail.com, and Janie, and then hit enter, and it says the username was janedoe@gmail.com, password is Janie. Okay, so when you're developing PHP scripts like this, what you do in the early stages, right, way before you release it for anybody else to use, is you do a lot of this kind of debugging to make sure that you really are passing the values that you think you are, and that you're really getting the values that were passed, right? So this verifies, okay, I know that I'm able to get, okay, the username and password that was entered by the user on the previous page, right? I verify it because I can see them right here. Okay, so once you do that, you don't really need to show those anymore. And you can start to think of, okay, what should I do now that I have been passed the username and password that the user entered? Okay, so the function that we need to use is basically the check ID function. So in Test Connect, right, this is how check ID works. What it does is it's going to return either the ID value, the correct ID value, or a -1 or a -2, depending upon the kind of error that occurred. That's what's going on here. So that's what we'd like to do. We want to call this function right here. Okay, so the way you do that is probably not obvious, but let's do this so that you can see how that works. Okay, so I'm going to create my SQL query, and it starts like this. Select check underscore ID, right? That's the name, check underscore ID. And then what we need to do is we need to pass the username and the password. Okay, so how is that going to work? Let me move this up because I don't need to see that part anymore. Okay, so I'm going to put a placeholder variable, :user for the username, and another placeholder variable, :PASS for the password. And I'm going to use prepare and execute. Okay, so we've looked at this a little bit before, so it's coming up again. So here's my prepared statement. So I'm just going to call it statement is equal to $PDO prepare $SQL. Okay. Now, I could have actually put $PDO and then the arrow query $SQL and actually run a query, right, that select check ID with username and pass. Okay, I could have done that, but, what am I doing? Sorry, take that back. I'm thinking too far ahead. That's how we'll do it eventually, but no, we can't do it that way. Okay, so what I got to do is call a check ID function. All right, so I'm going to say user ID. Okay, scratch what you just saw there. Okay, because that's not going to be till later on in the semester. Thinking too far ahead. Actually, not thinking. Okay, so check ID. That's the name of the function. Okay, and then what I need to do is put $username and $password. All right. So we'll do the simplest thing possible, which is use echo. Okay, so I'm going to say user ID, $user ID, and let's put a break element. All right. So user enters a username and password. We get those two values, okay, from the post super global array, the stuff that gets passed like this. And then we use them as arguments to the check ID function, and that returns an integer that will be positive if it's a valid ID. It'll be negative if it's got an error associated with that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to display that integer that gets returned. Okay, so I go to the command line, I check for syntax errors, right? Always do that. Anytime you make a change, check for syntax errors. Now I come back to the page, okay, force a reload, make sure I don't have any cached values inside of there, and then I'm going to try to enter janedoe@gmail.com, Janie. I hit enter, and it returns a 1. That's Jane Doe's actual ID. Okay, let's go back. Okay, let's enter an incorrect password. There's clearly an incorrect password, right? Hit enter, -2, because the username exists, but the password is wrong for that username. Let me go back. Let me put johndoe@gmail.com, and I put, doesn't matter what I put for the password, it's clearly wrong. Well, if I hit enter, returns a -1 because that's what it returns if it cannot find the user in the users table, right? So then, okay, that makes sense for that. So now I have the makings of what I need to, okay, to basically do the authentication. For today, we're going to do something simple, and then I'm going to go back to Lab 5 because writing to that JSON part, a lot of people didn't quite do that correctly, or they did it partly correct, but not fully correct. All right, so anyway, I verified that I got the user ID, and it's giving me the correct values. 1 when I entered correctly the username and password, -2 when I put in correct username but bad password, -1 when I got a username that doesn't exist in the users table. Okay, I verified that already. And so what I'm going to do is put in a selection statement here. Okay, so I'll go if, okay, $user ID is greater than 0, user authenticated. We're going to just echo that to the screen. Else, okay, so we'll treat -1 or -2, we'll treat that as the same case. Okay, what it is that it's not authenticated. Let me just hit some enters here. So if it's not greater than 0, then we didn't connect correctly. So let's start off with something pretty simple. Okay, not authenticated. So first thing I do is I check for syntax errors. Oh, I got a syntax error on line 18. Oops, what happened here? Oh, I got a crazy parentheses again. Same error, kind of error that I had before. Okay, so let me check. Okay, no syntax errors this time. So let's go back here, force a reload. Okay. Let's enter johndoe@gmail.com, put some garbage password. What it should say is not authenticated, right? That makes sense. Now let's put in janedoe@gmail.com. I'm going to put a wrong password for Jane Doe. Then it says not authenticated, right? We didn't differentiate between bad username and bad password. Both of them is not authenticated. Okay? And then let's enter in a correct password for Jane Doe, and it says user authenticated, right? So my selection statement is working basically correctly. Now, let's do one more thing before we go back to Lab 5. We'll take a short break and go back to Lab 5. When it's not authenticated, you could do a number of things, but one of the things you could do is you could return back to the login page, because maybe they entered it in and they just made a mistake, right? So they entered correct username, but they enter the wrong password, they just type something wrong. So what we could do is basically redirect back to the login page. So this is how that works. Header, and inside of quotes here, you put the word location, and then you put the name of the script that you're trying to relocate to. Okay, so this means jump to login.php. Anytime you put in a header command in PHP, the next line should be the exit function, which means that don't execute any more lines on this page. Now in this case, that's at the very end of the script, so it doesn't really matter, but it's better to do that because who knows, one day you might add something after that, right? And then it'll execute that even when it was supposed to jump to another page. So whenever you use the header command, always follow that with exit. All right, so check for syntax errors, no syntax errors. Come back to here, force a reload. Okay, then let's enter janedoe@gmail.com, but we enter a bad password, then it came back to this page, right? So okay, enter correct username and password, then it shows user authenticated. Okay, so you might be guessing that in the first case of the selection statement, when it's a valid ID, then instead of echoing this, then you're going to redirect to the home.php script. And if that's what you're guessing, that's correct. Okay, so that's going to be for another day, but that's the basic idea behind it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize the things that I don't need to see just yet. Okay, and what I'm going to do, let's see, where am I? I want to go to docs. Okay. Actually, one level above docs, I'm going to make a copy of this. Okay, and I'm going to paste it to the desktop. Oh, I already got one there. Let me get rid of that. Okay, and so when I paste it, then that's my current docs directory. And it has way too much stuff on it. So I open this up and I say, okay, I don't need this. So I'm going to delete that. And let's see, I don't need this, any of these. Okay. And project one, yeah, that's all okay, so I'll leave that. And then in CENT280, I don't need this, or this. So I'll delete all of those. And then in project one, I just have those files, and that's fine. Okay, so now, this docs folder on my desktop, I'm going to go send to compress zip file. I'm going to rename this. So docs, I'm going to put _02 _27 _2019. Okay, so today's date. And that's what I'm going to upload to Laulima. Okay, so, oh, it logged me out already. Okay, log back in. Okay, so in the daily work folder with today's date, I'm going to upload that zip file that I just created. so that if any of those scripts, you had trouble with them, you can always go ahead and get it from there. All right, so let's take a short break, and then we're going to talk about Lab 5. If you already turned in Lab 5 and got it back, they got credit for it, then you could go, because then all I'm going to talk about from this point forward is just Lab 5. Okay, so take a break, but if you're done with Lab 5, you can leave. If you turned in Lab 5 last time and then you got it back without any score on it, then you want to hang around so that you understand how to fix that.
Handed my Lab 5 in, but I haven't got it back. Does that mean I haven't used it?
No, that means somehow I didn't see it.